very difficult to second the proposition, because I thought I was seconding this proposition. But I am a man of many talents. I shall now oppose the proposition. There are many, many difficulties in understanding the nature of God, and understanding the nature of belief and of fraud, and so on. But on our side, things are very simple. If you believe there is a God, then we say he's a fraud. If you don't believe there's a God, you're already on our side, because we also say he's a fraud with regard to his existence. I think the opposition has a far more difficult case to answer, because as we know, there are many different types or makes or models of religious believers. There are Christians, there are Muslims, there are Hindus, there are Jews, and there may be Beckyians, for all I know. That might be a special religion. Take any particular religion, and there are many different brands or models or makes of it, many different versions or editions. And so therefore, when we talk about God, are we talking about the God who says homosexuality, despite my own friend in the bow tie, is forbidden? Or are we talking about the God? I can see it getting naturally to him. Or are we talking about the God who says homosexuality with or without the bow tie is fine? Are we talking about the God who says that ladies should be unveiled, should be completely covered in public? Or is this a God who announces that they can go around in bikinis? Well, maybe not tonight, but feel free to take it on board if you want. There are many, many difficulties, in other words, in understanding what God is. God has these problems about sex. Some religious believers announce that contraception is wrong. Some religious believers announce that God really thinks contraception is okay. Some religious believers tell us that God is compatible with evolutionary theory. Some say he's not, and so on. So either you're going to be committed to God being a fraud because he has these inconsistencies, or at the very least you're going to be committed to saying he's a fraud because he doesn't manage to explain himself very well to the people around us, given the many conflicts which they undergo. Historically, though, St. Anselm and others have talked about God as being that being than which nothing greater can be conceived. I was getting the impression this evening that maybe Becky was that being than which nothing greater can be conceived. Though not so hot on taxis from airports, I hasten to say. But that being than which nothing greater can be conceived was put forward by St. Anselm as a way of understanding God as having maximal reality. Well, if we think about greatness, then I suppose somebody is great if they overcome many obstacles. So maybe Mr. Bowtie here would, it's just because I forgot your name actually, would in fact be a pretty great guy if he managed to run and win the marathon. But think how much greater somebody would be if they were severely disabled and handicapped and managed to beat the healthiest guy at running a marathon. So greatness has something to do with what sorts of obstacles you overcome. So if God is the greatest being, what sort of obstacle would he have to overcome to make him really great in order to create the universe? Non-existence. Now if he could overcome his non-existence and create the universe, then he really would be the greatest being there is. That quippy comment is therefore to make the point that understanding God as being the greatest being is probably contradictory. It's probably like saying that there's the greatest number. Think of any number, you can always add another one, even if you are a banker, maybe. So, with regard to the greatness issue, then I think we're going to engage contradictions, and we do engage many, many contradictions with God. And I think that's why God should be perceived as a fraud. He's a fraud because he doesn't exist, and yet, unlike many things, somehow people think he's telling them that he does exist, and he's also a fraud because he has many incompatible properties. Unicorns. I quite like unicorns. They don't exist, but I don't think they're frauds. Did I upset somebody by saying they don't exist? Because unicorns don't purport to exist. They don't go around announcing that they exist. They just don't exist. Whereas God, it seems, for religious believers, somehow he's saying that we must worship him and cherish him, and he's going to be ever so nasty to us if we don't believe in him. So he clearly is putting forward this fraud that he does exist. There are many great ways of looking at the contradictions built within God to show that he is a fraud and doesn't exist. A classic one, which some of you may have come across, is that God is meant to be omnipotent. So he's meant to be able to do anything. So, of course, God can make an immovable post. But hold on, if he's omnipotent, if he's all powerful, he can move any immovable post. And so there clearly is a contradiction there. God can only do what is logically possible, and you have to decide. Do you think there's omnipotent God, an all-powerful God, or do you think there's an immovable post? I know Christians go for the God, but I think it's just as likely to go for an immovable post, if you want to see it that way. So that's to do with the contradiction built into God being all-powerful, but there are many others. As we know from strange texts called the Bible, the Quran, God is meant to be loving, and yet equally so, I think he allegedly said that the firstborn in Egypt some centuries ago had to be killed. God, I believe, somewhere in the Bible announces apparently that if you work on the Sabbath, then death should come your way. So it doesn't seem to be all that loving. Another contradiction. God is meant to be explanatory. People say, you need to postulate God in order to understand why the world exists. Well, that's very, very strange, isn't it? For a start, as David Hume said, the world is pretty much of a botched job. So if you want to postulate anything, you should postulate an infant deity or an apprentice deity who doesn't get on with it very well. But there's another point there, because Christians tell me, and I believe Muslims also will tell me, that God moves in a mysterious way, that God is incomprehensible, that God is beyond all human reason, that the great architect cannot be understood. So how can God possibly be understood as being an explanation of the universe? Because that's no explanation if it's just a mystery. You may as well stay put with the universe. And as the great Wittgenstein, I always preface the word Wittgenstein with, the great Wittgenstein, who used to holiday around the Southern Island, said, explanations have to come to an end. So why not accept the explanation ends with the universe rather than with God? Another incompatibility is you're meant to enjoy the idea that God is the foundation of morality. Well, come. Do we really believe that? As John Stuart Mill pointed out, if you look around the world, there's a numerous set of examples of items which should blacken God's name. It shouldn't actually lead you to think that God is the foundation of morality. Think of the suffering which goes on between animals, think of the suffering of human beings, the suffering maybe of audiences having to listen to me burping on. These are gratuitous sufferings, and yet God has permitted them or even caused them. In fact, I often think I should have sympathy for the devil, because if you want to think there must be some deity, some power behind this universe, surely it must be pretty devilish rather than this allegedly good God. Also, God, I think it's very fortunate if he's studying the morality line, because he tries to get you to be good, as I spill water. He tries to get you to be good by threatening you with eternal damnation if you're not. That is hardly a good moral motivation to be good. Some of us, some atheists, such as myself, humanists, agnostics, we have a simple slogan, you can be good without God. Yes, you do not need God to be good. And indeed, the understanding of God in the Bible and the Quran would actually lead us to think, I think, that God is far, far from good. I've already mentioned some cases in which you would actually allegedly condemn homosexuals. If you are a certain type of religious believer, you would actually be saying that you should kill other religious believers if they leave your faith, and so on. We all know many cases of the fatwa. There's a couple of other inconsistencies. I'm not sure how much time I have. Another inconsistency is to do with meaning and purpose. Some of my little friends, my big friends, they go around saying, life would be without meaning, would be without purpose if there wasn't a God. Well, how does God help? I mean, eternal life is as much of a mystery as finite life. And if you think of it, it doesn't really help when Christians say, that we are part of God's plan. That doesn't mean that your life is going to go well. Think of factory farmed animals. They are part of someone else's plans, but they in fact don't have a pretty good life, do they? So we might just be like the factory farmed animals in that case. So I think God is a fraud with regard to morality, and God is also a fraud with regard to giving meaning to life. You're going to be distressed if you think that for your life to have a point or meaning, it must then be pointing to something else. So if for A to have a point, there must be B, and then the point of B must be C, and then the point of C must be D. That's going to go on endlessly, and it's fraudulent for you to be reading about God that somehow God is the end of that. If things need to have external points, then obviously God needs to have an external point. And that brings me to the last point, namely sometimes people think, but God will give us the afterlife. Well, that's going to be terribly boring because the afterlife is infinite, so you'll be hearing this sort of discussion infinitely numbers of times ahead. Think how terrible that would be. I can see already some of you are nodding off, but these are just managing to keep their eyelids just about open. It's a bit touch and go, isn't it?